Good morning. Thank you for joining in today's presentation on Excel pivot tables. The session today will be presented by Alex Donos. Brief slide on who CTC Train Canada is. We are a privately owned Canadian organization and we were established in 1989. We are a Microsoft Gold learning partner and we have 11 facilities in major cities across Canada. And we have the ability to deliver courses in either English or French. The CTC Train Canada Guaranteed to Run philosophy. We take great pride in our ability to deliver your course without canceling or rescheduling due to low enrollment. As a result, for desktop and graphic application courses, we only require one student to guarantee them to run. For Microsoft technical training courses, the number is only 3 students. Today, your presenter will be Alex Donos, and I'm going to pass the mic over to him. He will be facilitating the session on Excel pivot tables.
All right. Hello, everyone. I just want to make sure that people can hear me there. Yes? Okay. Wonderful. I'm already hearing someone say yes. Wonderful. All right. So I just wanted to go through, and much like Laura had just mentioned, we're going to be dealing with pivot tables today using Excel 2010. And I just wanted to make sure that we are all able to see the file that I'm currently working with. It should say the employee chart.xlsx up at the top of the screen. And we're just validating that right now. All right, great. At this point, you guys should be seeing an active Windows dialog box with a listing of pivot table files, and I'm just going to pop open the employee chart right now, and you guys should be able to see my screen at the moment. It's just a quick little database, very small, multi-level list, showing last names, first names, dates of hire, department that these random people work in, their salaries, and the bonuses that they have gotten. All right, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pivoting or moving this data around in order to come up with some really reliable and useful summaries and inferences that we can come up with based on the data at hand. Now, if you've ever worked with pivot tables before, you know that they really are a very fast and effective way of summarizing and analyzing data. Now, pivot comes from the French word pirouette, which means to spin or to turn, and the main purpose of a pivot table is to spin and turn our information around to come up with new and oftentimes surprising results that we normally would take a lot longer to do with standard Excel functions and formulas. The first thing that I want to make sure that I can do is understand whether or not this data is essentially worthy of becoming a pivot table. And by worthy, I just mean, does it meet a certain set of requirements to make sure that it's going to pivot nicely and easily. First thing that we have to make sure of is that I am working with a 2010 database in order to take advantage of all the new features associated with Excel 2010. So I can see that it is an XLSX file, and as such, we're dealing with a much expanded database. As you can see, we have 1,048,576 rows, which is much larger than the standard 46,000 and change. The next thing I want to make sure of is that I have no missing rows, no missing columns. You'll notice over here under bonus that we have some blanks, and we'll attend to those later. But blank spots are fine. They can cause you a little bit of a headache later on if you're looking to construct averages based on the standard arithmetic mean. However, for now, blank cells are okay as long as it's no empty rows, empty columns. So no empty rows, empty columns, no missing rows, no missing columns, no hidden rows, no hidden columns. And I know oftentimes we like to shrink a database down in order to be able to only keep the headings or the fields that are of interest to us. But if you're going to actually go ahead and do so, actually physically remove the unwanted data and don't just simply hide it, because at the end of the day, when you develop this data into a pivot table, it's actually going to take everything. And finally, and most importantly, no merged cells. Now, merging cells has one sole benefit, and that is to get nice, centered, attractive-looking titles. However, they actually tend to be a little bit of a nuisance when it comes to more advanced data analysis. So a good rule of thumb in general, if you're the type of person that passes off spreadsheets to someone to do further analysis on, is to avoid merging cells at all costs. So in other words, it's not just pivot tables that are affected by merge cells, but rather a variety of different advanced functions. Now, I can see now that this is set up in a way that it's going to pivot well. The next thing that I want to make sure of is that I see good repetition and I'm working with clean data. Now, that's a lot easier said than done. Clean data essentially means that I have good repetition and correct spelling. As you can see, human resources is spelled the same way each time. A really quick way to validate this is just to click anywhere inside your data, go to the sort and filter command, and go down to a standard auto filter. I'm going to take a quick look at the drop down from department now, and I can see I have all my different departments here. Now, if I had misspelled management, for instance, I would see one field that says management and one that said, say, management, if I forgot to put the E in. And so I'd be made rightly aware that I had a bit of a problem. Cleaning data typically takes around 50% of the time when it comes to data analysis, because sometimes we have extra spaces, especially if our data is coming from data entry personnel or keyed in data. Typically about 5% of the data at maximum is faulty if that's the case. And there's a variety of different techniques, including find and select and replace all, to help with scenarios like that. Today, however, we are just going to be following the pivot tables with the assumption that our data is perfect. Next thing I want to make sure is that our formatting is good. And when I'm talking about formatting, I'm talking specifically about date formatting. Because there are additional features we can use when dates are defined as dates, I simply want to click on the letter C, which is going to highlight my whole column. I can see that it's set as general, and that's just because I have multiple date formats associated with this column. If I click on C2, we see general, but if I click on C3, it's organized as date. If I highlight all of my dates, and the easiest way to do that is Control-Shift and the downwards key, that will get me all the way to the bottom from a defined point, in this case C3. I can see in the format right along the top here that it is indeed defined as a date. So I know that all my date formats are correct. At this point, I'm ready to start pivoting. I'm going to click in any filled cell within my database, and I'm going to go to the Insert tab. All right, that's just directly to the right of the Home tab. Then the very first group, the Tables group, you'll see the very first button, which says Pivot Table. And it says that to insert a pivot table, it is used to summarize data using a pivot table. Pivot tables make it easy to arrange and summarize complicated data and drill down on details. And we'll talk about the drilling down on details when we look at our second example, a more advanced pivot table. But for now, we're just going to make a simple one. I'm going to click on the Pivot Table command, and it's asking me to choose the data you want to analyze. Now, assuming that I have no missing rows, no missing columns, no hidden rows, no hidden columns, it's naturally going to select the entire database, including the headers, which will eventually become my field list. And where do I want the pivot table to be placed? I'm typically always going to choose a new worksheet unless otherwise instructed. I'm going to go ahead and say OK now. And this is the basic pivot table interface. So it's basically broken down into 4 main sections. My actual pivot table is going to be generated over here, and it says to build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list. But even though this picture suggests that you're simply going to put check marks inside the boxes in the field list over here, I would actually challenge you not to put check boxes at all, but rather drag the fields down into one of these 4 quadrants, which we'll speak about shortly. The reason being is because oftentimes we want to decisively choose where exactly our data is going to fall rather than letting Excel suggest it for us. This way we can take full control over our data sets. The second major quadrant is the Pivot Table Tools contextual tab that we see located along the top. That's broken down into sub-tabs, Options, which goes through different pivot table options that we have with our data, as well as Design, which is more of the aesthetic or design or layout options that we see available, which is changing the styles, changing colors, working with blank rows, whether or not we want to see subtotals or grand totals, and little design choices like that. Predominantly the work we're going to work with is available here under Options within the Pivot Table Contextual tab. The third section is the pivot table field list, and these headings these fields actually should look familiar because they're the headings that we saw in sheet 1, where we can see located along the top. When I go into sheet 4, these have been converted into fields, which means a single heading or field represents all the data held therein. These fields can be shown either in list form like this, directly above our four major quadrants: the report filter, the column labels, the row labels, and the summation values. Now this whole thing together is known as the field list, and we can see under Pivot Table Tools Options, we can both hide and show the field list under the Show grouping. Now, there in the field list selection and area selection, we can see that the current selection is based on stacked, which means I have all my fields on top and my quadrants beneath it. Now, I can manipulate this and change it so that I have field sections listed on the left and my quadrants on the right. This is very useful, especially if I have an extremely lengthy field list and I want to be able to see more all at once. I also have the options of the field section only or the area section only, defined as either quadrants or stacked above one another. I typically don't choose anything from the last three options, simply because the idea of dragging and dropping our fields directly onto the pivot table is a behavior that we see predominantly akin to 2003 pivot tables, and something that we don't typically do in 2010. It is simpler and more effective to actually bring the fields directly into the quadrants themselves and allow the pivot table to generate itself based on our choices in the pivot table field list. And then finally we have our quadrants: the report filter, the column labels, the row labels, and the summation values. The report filter used to be called the page fields in 2003, but it is exactly the same thing. The column labels were the column area, the row labels were the row area, and in 2003 the summation values were known as the data area. Okay, so their functionality is exactly the same as it always has been, except the report filter and the summation values has two new titles now. So it's just the name of them, but they do exactly the same function. The report filter is essentially the subject of the pivot table, and people may or may not choose to actually even use the report filter. All right, that's essentially if we want to drill down the pivot table into one specific category, for instance. Our column labels are the headings that we would see listed within the columns or along the top of the pivot table when generated. The row labels tend to go along the left. As such, because we here in the West read books from left to right, top down, typically it's advisable to begin your pivoting by dragging things into the row labels. It typically makes sense because we typically work with charts and data and graphs, looking at them from left to right, top down. So by populating the first list, moving downwards in the row labels, we're able to do that. And I can see if I just take department and I simply drag it down into the row labels, it develops that list for me. So I can see billing, CEO, customer service, distribution, human resources, etc. And because I'm only seeing one per category, this is once again validating that I'm working with perfect data. If I had billing spelt with one L, for instance, it would separate billing with two L's and billing with one L simply below it. The next thing we might want to take a look at pivoting is thinking about exactly other ways that we want to look at these different departments. Now, as I said, the subject line or the subject of the pivot table typically is the report filter. The rows typically is where we'll put in our categories or our series. Categories being, in this case, different departments. Series might be something like time or temperature, something that has a standard distribution to it and a standard ascension or descension. Purchase orders, work orders, sales orders, things where you always know exactly what's going to follow next. For instance, Tuesday always follows Monday, February always follows January, PO 123 always follows PO 122. Okay, so anything that's more series-oriented, we typically, but not always, see within the column labels. Finally, we have the summation values, and that's where I'm going to put my calculables. And I do say calculables and not standard numbers. Oftentimes people forget that text indeed can be calculated as well. Unfortunately, the only type of calculation that it can perform is counting. Sometimes, however, that's all that we need. If I'm working with an inventory management system or any kind of database based on inventory, I can count how many incidences of a certain item number exists by simply dragging it into the summation values. Similarly, if I want to see how many times a certain person's identification number appears within a list, it can be counted in the summation values as well. In this case, I want to be able to work on some standard calculations, and about 9 times out of 10, we are talking about numbers in our calculables or summation values section. I'm going to drag salary down to summation values, and that's going to do a quick subtotal of all of our different departments and the cost of salaries, or in this case referred to as the sum of salaries that are listed within each row. So billing, we have a total of 77,000. The CEO makes 300,000. Customer service, 95,000, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is a quick little way that we can very instantly and quickly develop a subtotal report. Now, subtotals are a standard reporting technique used in standard Excel, but we can get there just as quickly using a pivot table and then get into further details. Now, the pivoting aspect appears when we actually move a field from one quadrant to another. So, for instance, had I chosen to move department into the column labels, my graph is going to be distributed differently. However, you'll notice billing 77,000, CEO 300,000, customer service 95,000, etc. This is actually showing exactly the same information that I would see with the department in the rows. However, we typically tend to view things this way as a more common way of viewing, but that is not to say that having our fields in the column labels is any less accurate. This table is presenting the exact same data, only less familiarly than we would see in the row labels. Next, I might want to break down exactly who is in these different departments, and we can see that we have a listing of last names as well. Now, I can add more than one field to a specific quadrant. It makes sense, however, to make sure that we're watching the order in which these fields actually fall. Last name, for instance, I'm going to be placing beneath departments. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I know, based on standard logic and common sense, that there are people in departments, not departments in people. Therefore, last name I'm going to think of as a subcategory of the parent category being department. And once again, it's going to be calculating not only a subtotal for each separate department, but it's also going to be capturing each person's individual salaries as well as a grand total along the bottom. Now, another thing we may want to choose to calculate within this pivot table might be the actual bonuses that people are getting. At that point, I'm going to take bonus and I'm going to place it beneath the sum of salary. Now, in this case, the default did not work correctly, and we see that it actually calculated the count of bonus. Now, I'm not going to be alarmed at this because I can change the actual calculation at hand very, very simply. You'll notice that within all of my fields, I've got little drop-down arrows next to them. Okay, so I'm going to go to the count of bonus drop-down arrow, and you'll see that I have a variety of different options here in terms of actual pivoting and analyzing the data. Now, the first bunch that you see all start with the word move. Move up, move down, to the beginning, to the end, to the report filter, or any other of the different quadrants, or simply remove field. The reality is, however, that I'm not actually going to use any of these commands at all, simply because there's a far faster way to use it with the mouse, and that's simply being able to drag and drop. Moving the field up and down is as simple as dragging it from, if I wanted the bonus from after salary to before salary. And now I have my count of bonus and then my sum of salary. So all my movements I'm going to simply do by drag and drop. If I wanted to use the final function, the second final function, which was remove field with big X, I'm simply going to drag my count of bonus somewhere that is not active. So anywhere where I see this X appear beneath my cursor, once I release my mouse left click, you'll notice that it actually vanishes from the quadrants and also from the pivot table. Bonus now is back up to the top and is deselected. So I'll move that back in. I still have to deal with the fact that this is set up as a count of bonus, however. I'll click on my drop-down, and you'll notice that aside from all of these movements, which I'm not going to actually use, my very last option says Value Field Settings. And this is one of the most important aspects of pivot tables, is the adjustment of your value field settings. Now, it's been my experience that when people are troubleshooting pivot tables, 9 times out of 10, it's a trouble with the value field settings, not the actual pivoting itself. I'm going to choose value field settings, And you can see that the source name is bonus, and we can even key in a custom name if we want. So if I'm unsatisfied with these titles, I can modify them right here with a custom name. Now it says summarize value fields by. Choose the type of calculation that you want to summarize the data from the selected field. And we have our standard variety of options. Sum, which adds things up. Count, which counts things up. Average, which uses the standard arithmetic mean to construct the simple average. Max, which shows me the biggest in the field. Min, which shows me the smallest in the field. Product, which refers to the result of a multiplication question. For example, 5 times 3 is 15. 15 is the product of 5 and 3. Count numbers, which will count only the numeric values within a cellular range. Standard deviation, which assumes a 5% error. Standard deviation of population, which assumes a 1% error. Variance, 5% error, and variance of population, 1% error. Now these last 4 all have to do with statistical analysis, and you may or may not use them. But I encourage you that if you are going to calculate standard deviation through variance of population or anything in between, just make sure you understand exactly the method of calculation it's performing. For now, however, I simply want to return things to sum from count, and so I'll select sum, and I will say OK. And now, all of a sudden, I'm able to see the sum of my bonus projected directly beside the sum of salary. Now, something interesting has happened here automatically. You'll notice that my summation values itself has automatically pivoted to the column labels. Now, in 2003 Excel and earlier, you would have had to make this a manual pivot. However, because this is the Train interface, it has a few more assumptions that it works with. Or in other words, it works with a little bit more intelligence to it. So it automatically makes that change to both vertical and vertical, which is the way that you see it right now, without any intervention whatsoever. At this point, I can see a quick summary of each of my different people and the categories that's showing where the departments they're in and all the money that they'll be collecting as a result. Now, one thing that I might want to do, especially if I'm new to pivot tables, is work with a very formalized structure. Okay. One moment. Okay, I was just checking the chat questions there. Now, one of the things I might want to do if I'm new to pivot tables is make things a little bit easier on the person I'm sending the report to. Someone who's unfamiliar with pivot tables might not realize that this table is being generated from all of the data on sheet 1. So a good rule of thumb to kind of work with when you're just kind of getting started is to rename sheet 1 source. Okay, and by renaming it source, it kind of suggests to people that this is where the information is coming from, and it's going to be filtered into the pivot table itself. Now on sheet 4, I'm going to rename this simply pivot, so it's very clear exactly which one is the source data and which one is the table that's being generated. I know some of them have had that question from new pivot table users because they're not sure which one filters into which. At this point, I might want to change my calculations on a little bit. I've got my information on sum of salary, and that's looking pretty good. Okay, maybe I want to change this instead of a sum of salary, rather to an average of salary. I'll go into my value field settings. I'll change sum to average and say OK. I'll then do the same thing with sum of bonus. I'll change my value field settings into an average of bonus. And then all of a sudden, things appear to the layman to be just fine. However, we've actually made a very crucial mistake. Unfortunately, within pivot tables, we don't necessarily see errors like we typically would within standard Excel. For instance, we see all blanks where people simply don't get bonuses. Okay, everything is listed there as a blank, which makes sense because no one in human resources happen to have information in relation to a bonus, for instance. The real error, however, comes with things that we might have just simply quickly glossed over. Take a look at customer service, for instance. We have Grieve with no bonus, Caseta with no bonus, and Schneider with a $500 bonus. The customer service average bonus is listed as $500. The reason this happened is because it took its only value, being 500, and divided it by 1, because only one person got a bonus, and came up with the average of bonus being $500. Unfortunately, logically and realistically, this is not true. All 3 people were candidates for bonus, but only one of them actually got it. This is one of the tricks from working with blanks instead of zeros in all of your cells. In order to change this, I actually have to change it from the original source. I'll go back to the source data. I'll highlight the range where I have blanks. I'll go to Find and Select, Replace, and what am I looking for? I'm just looking for a blank. To define it, I'm simply going to key nothing in there. And replace with what? I'm going to put in a 0. So every time you see a blank, put in a 0. I'll say replace all, and Excel made 12 replacements. And I say OK, and I can close off my Find and Replace. Next, I'm going to go back to my pivot table, and you'll notice that actually nothing has happened. All right. This proves a very, very important point, that pivot tables are not linked to their source data. What I'm going to do now is simply go back to my options, and you'll see this button here that says refresh. Update the information in the workbook that is coming from the data source. When I click refresh, my zeros come in, and notice my customer service average. It's plummeted to 166 2/3. So in other words, we're now dealing with entirely different answers here. The moral of the story is be very cautious in terms of whether you're working with blanks or zeros. I wish I could tell you that in all cases use blanks or in all cases use zeros, but the reality is that it's a lot more important just to be aware that there is a bit of a hiccup when working with zeros versus blanks, and just to be aware of that hiccup and to make the appropriate choice contingent upon your own data and your own information, because sometimes it's best to have blanks and sometimes it's best to have zeros in their place. Okay. The next thing that I might want to be able to take a look at here is being able to add up our 2 salaries. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip our average of salary back to sum, and my average of bonus back to sum as well. Now I might want to be able to figure out, well, what's my total income perhaps? All right. One of the things that I can do to address this is I can approach this from 2 different standpoints. Now, there's kind of the best way of doing this, and then the satisficing way of doing things. The satisficing way being just sort of the quick and easy way of dealing with it, and the other being the more effective. The quick and easy way of dealing with it is to simply click inside D4 outside the range of the pivot table, hit my little auto sum, which is going to add up B4 through C4, hit enter, and autofill down. All right, and that's going to add up all my salaries and bonuses. However, this is not the most effective way to work. Instead, what I would rather do is construct a calculated field directly within the pivot table itself that will generate its own actual field. So what I'm going to do is simply click inside my data. Click inside my data. It doesn't really matter where. And I'm going to go to the Options tab. Now, from my pivot table options, I'm going to go to the Calculations group and look where it says Fields, Items, and Sets. I'm going to choose Fields, Items, and Sets and choose the first option, Calculated Field. When I choose that, I can start constructing my own personal custom calculated field. First thing I have to do is give it a name, and I'm going to simply call this Total Income. And that is calculated by taking our salary, and I just double click on salary to add it to the formula, plus, and I will double click on bonus. Alright, so total income equals salary plus bonus, and then I'll click add. Alright, and now I have total income within my field list. I can see it over here in my field list that exists, and I simply say OK. Alright, and I just simply pushed it next to sum of bonus and sum of salary. At this point, I can now choose whether or not I want to actually even have my salary or bonus. So in other words, I can basically take my salary out, my bonus out, all right, and simply view this as a summation of total income. And so even though total income does not exist as a field within my source data, it is exclusively the calculation that exists in my actual pivot table itself. Now, if I wanted to be able to provide a proof that shows that this is exactly this is where total income came from, so just delete the sheet that I don't need, that I created an error. All I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my pivot table tools options, go back into fields, edits, and sets, and choose list formulas. When I click list formulas, a calculated field list is generated that shows the order in which all my fields can be solved, the name of the field, and the actual formula held therein. As such, I'm going to rename sheet 6 simply as either proof or formulas or perhaps appendix, whatever I feel is the most appropriate. And then I'll take my proof and I'll put it to the right of the pivot table, but before the source. Okay. And there, as we can see, oh, and I just have a really quick question from Van Lee to our panelists. May I ask where I would find these fields, items, and sets in Excel 2007? That's a very interesting question. Fields, items, and sets are actually called, I believe it's called calculated fields. If you go under pivot table options in 2007, it should be the first button on the left of the options tab. You should see either calculated fields or formulas listed there. And under formulas, you'll find calculated field. Fields, items, and sets as a term is only used in 2010. Okay. Okay. Next, I'd like to use the rest of the time allotted to quickly go through. Oh, okay, good. Found it. I'd like to quickly go through a more advanced pivot table to show you the speed in which one of our data can be set up for analysis. Okay, so I'm going to simply minimize this pivot table and open up the salespeople database.xlsx. Oh, how to bring the first name over to display as well. That's actually a bit of a trick, and I'll show you right now, actually, before I go into that. Okay. Let me just maximize the screen here. I'll go back to my pivot table, and I'm going to bring first name down underneath last name. Now, unfortunately, what this does is creates a bit of a problem because it's trying to subtotal everything. So I'm actually going to bring first name above last name, and we can see them all sort of next to each other right now. But it still creates a bit of a problem. So what I'm going to do is go to my pivot table tools design. That's right, this is a design function. Go to my subtotals button, and do not show subtotals. Oops, so I had my cursor on the sum of total income at that point. I'm going to click under the first name, Chris, and do not show subtotals. Change my report layout to become in outline. Oops, sorry, tabular form. And now we can see the department billing has Chris Potter, Jason Simmons, Raymond Gravel. So Judy Mamalidi, there you are. That's how we can show the first names next to the last names. It's changing the report layout to tabular form, as well as removing the subtotals. Another way to do this would be to simply construct a concatenation formula equals concatenate directly in the source data, which would merge our first names and our last names together into a singular field prior to actually generating the pivot table. All right, I'd like to move on now to the next pivot table, more advanced one, which we're going to be talking about these two different sales reps. Oh, sorry, these two different countries of sales teams, one in the UK and one in the US. First, a little bit of background. Here we have sales transactions. All right, we have two countries, the UK and the US. They're mutually exclusive, which simply means that Suyama, who sells in the UK, does not sell in the US, and Peacock, who sells in the US, does not sell in the UK. When a transaction is is ordered, it happens on a specific date, which is defined as a date. An order ID is generated, and an amount is billed. Now, that amount, for ease of analysis, all British sterling has been converted into USD. Now, I can see that everything looks pretty good, and I'm going to assume that my data is clean, which I do need to caution you extremely strongly about. Never assume that your data is clean unless it's coming in from some kind of Scantron or import from an external database. Cleaning the data, as I mentioned at the beginning, does typically occupy 50% of the time used for analysis. Simply click inside my data, and I'm going to go to Insert and Construct a Pivot Table. This range looks correct, and I say OK. I'll go back to my source, define it as source, go into my Sheet 4, and define it as pivot. Now I want to start discussing the different ways we can analyze this database very quickly. Immediately, I want to start taking a look at different salespeople because let's say I have to manage this team and I want to have a conference call with them. I want to look at my different salespeople and understand their sales. So I'll take salespeople and drop it into the rows. And I have a listing of all my people. Now, I have people in countries, not countries and people, so I'll take my countries and place that above it. All right, and as you can see, I have my my British reps as well as my American reps listed thusly. Now I'm going to take my order amount, and this being money or finance is a calculable, and I'll move it into my summation values. And now I have a list of my sum of order amounts and how much each person made. Now, this is typically where I see a lot of people stop. They're like, okay, well, that's how much each person made, and I've got myself a nice little summary. But, I mean, we can accomplish this with a subtotal report. We want to do something a little bit more fun. So I'm going to start playing around with my dates. And as I mentioned before, it is so vital that your dates are formatted as dates, not just something as general, not something custom, but as dates. So just try to modify the dates so that they fall into any of the date sub-formats. I'll take order date, and I'm going to move this to the column labels so I can measure each person against each additional date. I pop that in, and now we can see each person's sales made on each subsequent date. Now, on days like July 15th, 2003, for instance, we see that Dodsworth made a sale in the UK. Simultaneously, Leverling made a sale within the US. Now, these are my groupings, and I can expand and collapse them by simply clicking on the pluses and minuses as well. This looks okay, but in reality, this pivot table database is still really kind of huge. I mean, wow, that's a lot of dates. We're expanding over the course of basically about 3 years here. And really, we've just taken our database and basically split it in half. I want to be able to do something more funky with this, so I'm going to click on a single date. All right, and please pay attention to what I'm doing here. My dates, which are defined as dates, I've now clicked on a single date. I'm now going to go into my options, and the third group says group, and the third button says group field. I'll click on group field and see how I can define the start date and the end date. I can now choose whether to group it by months or any other category, including quarters and years. Now, a word of caution to everyone attempting to use the word quarters. If you choose to group by quarters, which I just did there, and as you can see, it's much, much, much shorter, please bear in mind, this assumes that your fiscal and your calendar year are the same. If your fiscal year and your calendar year are not the same, you have to do additional manipulation, quite an extensive amount of manipulation, in fact, to your source data in order to generate this. If your fiscal and your calendar year are the same, go right ahead and use the quarter feature of grouping. Okay? Now I'm looking now at a monthly, quarterly, and yearly summary of UK versus US. And I might even go ahead and drop the months out. Because I didn't choose day as one of the dates, order date now refers to months. So if I take my order date and I drag it over here to Nowhere Land and release, it's now removed, and I have a quarterly and annual summary comparing the UK to the US. All right, so I've managed to do all of this in just a matter of minutes. There are some more advanced features we can do directly with these sales, however. The sales values alone, any sales manager will tell you, is insufficient because sales oftentimes is both competitive and relative. As such, we need to understand not only our values in terms of the dollar amounts, but how they stack up relative to each other rep. I'll go now to my sum of order amount, go into my value field settings, but there's no additional calculation other than sum that's going to actually present this. So instead of summarizing the values by sum, I'm going to go over to show values as. You can see that there's actually no calculation applied here. This is one of the more advanced pivot table functions. If I go to my drop-down arrow, you can see that there is a variety of different ways of presenting this as a percentage or a running total. And I urge all people listening that if you are looking for more advanced pivot table functions, to familiarize yourself with what each one of these different percentages will actually do. In some cases, they will not apply to your pivot table structure, and some they will. I'm just going to show you a couple of the basics right now. So percentage of column, for instance. I'll choose percentage of column and say OK. Now I'm looking at this as a percentage of how much each rep contributed to the grand total for that particular quarter, which automatically will construct a bit of a different ranking. So I'm not looking at my values so much as I'm looking at my percentages. So we've got a variety of different areas to set up there. And I'm just going to see that we have to wrap up shortly, so I just want to show you one last final thing. I'll take my value field settings and put them back to normal, to no calculation as it were, and I'll say OK. That's defined as normal in 2007, by the way, for those people using that interface, and I'll say OK. And I'll now show you my favorite part of pivot tables, which is the extrapolation. As I mentioned at the beginning, the report filter is for the subject. So let's say I wanted to speak to each one of my different reps within the subject of their sales. I'll tell salesperson and drop it in the report filter, and then go to a very specific area, which is pivot table options, options drop down, and show report filter pages. Now that again is options tab, options group drop down, and show report filter pages. When I click here, it gives you the option to show all report filter pages from, and it gives me a list of whoever is in the page fields or the report filter fields. When I click OK, watch what's going to happen down here. I say OK, and it generates a separate pivot table independently of every single person in the report filter. And so whether I make one pivot table for each rep or all pivot tables for each rep, it's going to be done simultaneously. This is where the speed of pivot tables really starts to take effect, because you can just imagine how long it would take to construct separate tables based on each individual person. Okay, and it even names the sheets based on the identity provided within that specific field, in this case being salesperson. All right. So what I'd like to do right now is just thank all of you for attending this session. I can see now that we are pretty much out of time, so I hope that this has been as useful to you as it's been fun for me to be able to show this to all of you guys. And if there are any additional questions, yeah, feel free to raise your hand, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to you via email. All right, so I'm just going to exit desktop sharing right now and say thank you very much.